dating back to World War II and collect the riches that may come along with it. Legend has it that a Nazi train filled with gold was lost 7 decades ago. But is it just that?
After the war, much of the gold that was stolen by the Nazis was found, but there's still millions of dollars of gold missing, and that's the focus of our investigation. And I think we need to get on the ground and begin our investigation.
Near the end of the war, Allied investigators went through the Reichsbank's transport records and noticed something unusual. One large shipment of gold, foreign currency, and other valuables had been sent out by train, but the full paperwork for it was missing. A few notes confirmed parts of the trip, but most details were unclear. This raised a question that has lasted for decades. Was there a real Nazi gold train? And where did it go? When researchers reviewed the files again after the war, they found 4 separate clues. Each one pointed to gold or valuables moved by rail. In this documentary, we go through the records, the overlooked documents, and the evidence that helps explain what the gold train actually was and what was finally discovered. As the German front collapsed in early 1945, these scattered sightings began to make more sense. Rail traffic across Lower Silesia was no longer routine. It had shifted into something improvised and rushed, shaped by fear of losing everything to the advancing Red Army. On January 12th, when the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive began, the impact was immediate. Towns that had been quiet rear area posts only a week earlier were suddenly evacuation zones. Polish rail junctions fell in quick succession, and by the end of January, German officials were stripping out anything that still held value. Records, currency, gold reserves, and even private holdings taken by occupation authorities were pushed west toward the Sudeten foothills. This was not coordinated in the usual way. Orders came in fragments. Some were verbal only. Others were written down and then destroyed after decoding. That disorder is what allowed certain shipments to leave almost no trace behind. Silesia had long been a natural choice for these transfers. Its rail network was dense, built up since the 19th century to support mining and industry. The landscape offered something else as well: ridges, forest cover, old tunnels, and access to underground sites that had been expanded during the war. By February, many Nazi ministries treated the region as a last safe zone. Gauleiter Karl Hanke, running the city of Breslau as it prepared for a siege, gave instructions to move administrative funds out of the city while there was still time. A few entries in local archives confirm that convoys of crates left Breslau under SS protection, yet the documents do not say where those convoys were going. They only note departure times. Arrival records are missing. At the same time, on the ground, ordinary civilians noticed things they could not explain. In Walbrzych, a shopkeeper wrote in her diary that sealed rail cars passed through at night, each guarded by men in what she described as dark uniforms with no markings. In Jelenia Gora, a station worker mentioned a freight consist that came in with its windows covered and its locomotive crew replaced immediately after uncoupling. These small details are not dramatic, but they matter, because they match reports in Opole and along the Gorlitz-Wrocław corridor. People saw trains that did not follow normal procedures. No loading sheets were posted, no station logs were signed. Some of the cars appeared to be carrying heavy crates, stacked in ways that required specialized handling teams. After the war, when Allied investigators revisited these places, they found that several of the abandoned freight cars had no paperwork at all. This pattern shows up again in railway staffing records. A handful of train crews were reassigned for a single, unexplained run somewhere in Lower Silesia and then sent back to their regular depots. None of them had written orders attached to their files for those days. In one case, a conductor from Gorlitz returned with a note saying only that he had completed special duty. He was then transferred out of the region. These pieces may seem small, but taken together, they form a picture of a system moving wealth under conditions where secrecy was treated as more important than documentation. When Reichsbank managers later reported partial manifests, they were not exaggerating. Some shipments had only a destination code, and even that code no longer matched known rail stations by March 1945. The network itself was breaking down. Yet within this chaos, one location kept appearing in scattered reports. It was not a major city, nor a primary rail hub, but it sat at a point where several lines converged before entering the mountains. The area had sidings, maintenance sheds, and access to older tunnels once used for freight traffic. It also lay close to sites that the SS had quietly taken over for wartime construction projects. When researchers compared wartime diaries, railroad notes, and the incomplete Reichsbank files, this place showed up more often than chance would allow. It appeared in conversations with former station workers, in handwritten notes from local administrators, and in one Allied interrogation transcript involving an SS logistics officer. That location became the center of attention for later investigators. It was where the movements of these sealed trains seemed to align. It was where several lines from Breslau, Opola, and the surrounding districts connected before heading deeper into territory controlled by SS engineering units. And it was the site where, years later, researchers would begin to uncover evidence that suggested the missing wartime shipment, the one that started this entire search, had not simply vanished. What they eventually found there, hidden beneath decades of silence, would push the investigation in a direction no one expected. By early 1945, the people running Germany's financial system understood that the war was entering its final stage. The Allied bombing of Berlin on February 3rd, which involved more than 1,000 American aircraft, damaged the main Reichsbank building on Wilhelmstrasse. The vaults beneath it remained intact, but the structure above was no longer safe. This event forced senior officials to act quickly. Walter Funk, who served as Reich Minister of Economics, and Emil Pohl, the vice president of the bank, both received orders to prepare the movement of what remained of Germany's gold and foreign reserves. According to post-war interrogation files, the amount still under their control included around 2,700 gold bars, along with various currencies. In 1945 terms, the total value was estimated at nearly $500 million. This did not include smaller items such as coins, jewelry, or melted gold that had come from seized private valuables in occupied areas. The gold had been collected over several years. Some came from government reserves taken during invasions. In March 1939, Germany forced Czechoslovakia to surrender its central bank gold. After the invasion of Belgium in 1940, the Germans traced and seized the Belgian reserves that had been moved to France. The Hungarian central bank was stripped in 1944, with its gold transported to the Reichsbank under SS oversight. Beyond these official reserves, there was also gold gathered from private owners in occupied countries, which the bank processed. Items were melted down into bars to make them easier to store and count. Allied investigators later confirmed these details through captured documents and interviews with Reichsbank staff. When Soviet forces reached the Oder River in mid-February 1945, the pressure to move the gold out of Berlin increased. A memorandum written after the February bombing called for its immediate transfer. The plan used small rail convoys disguised as industrial shipments, with machinery or barrels placed on top of the crates. SS guards traveled with the trains, and their orders were kept separate from regular railway files. This made the transports difficult to trace after the war. One major destination was the Merkers salt mine in Thuringia, sometimes referred to as the Kaiserode mine. It had deep shafts, large underground rooms, and a stable temperature, making it suitable for storage. Mines like this had already been used for art, documents, and equipment. Workers in the area later recalled trucks arriving at unusual hours and guards who told them to leave certain tunnels alone. These memories matched the timeline of the evacuation. The convoys left Berlin between late February and early March, just as the situation in the capital became unstable. But the Merkers transfer was not the only movement of valuables. Allied investigators later found that several shipments also went toward Silesia. These were separate from the official Reichsbank convoys. Some were arranged by regional party leaders, others by SS units with their own caches of seized goods. This is where the earlier pattern of sealed trains, missing documents, and sudden crew reassignments becomes important. The files show that, while the central bank moved its gold to Thuringia, other groups were sending different collections of valuables toward the rail junctions and tunnels near the Sudeten foothills. These shipments were not as well recorded, which is why they became harder to trace after the war. A few surviving notes hint at how these transports overlapped. A short message from Breslau in early March 1945 stated that financial assets had been moved out for safety, but did not list their contents or destination. Another document from Opola referred to a special train, exempt from standard reporting. When Allied teams compared these notes with railway worker accounts, they found that sealed trains passed through Silesia at the same time official gold was being sent to Merkers. This overlap created confusion. The US Army later found large amounts of gold at Merkers, but the existence of other trains moving into Silesia suggested that not everything had been accounted for. Some of these transports did not appear in normal records, supporting the idea that certain caches were handled separately, likely by SS technical units or local party leaders using remaining open routes. Researchers studying this period had to sort through conflicting material. Some files were incomplete, others had been damaged or lost. A number of people involved in the transports either died in the final battles or fled west. But the surviving records showed that the system was strained, and different groups made their own decisions about valuable items under their control. That is why the Silesian rail lines continued to draw attention decades later. They were busy in early 1945, and several unusual transports passed through them at the same time that the Reichsbank evacuation was underway. As more evidence came together, investigators realized they had to separate the well-documented Berlin to Merkers transfer from the lesser-known movements heading toward the region that had long been linked to rumors of a missing train. This distinction became important because it raised a simple question. If the official gold went west, what exactly was being moved south into Silesia? The answer to that question began to emerge when researchers uncovered records that had been overlooked for years. One of the earliest solid clues came from a February 9, 1945 convoy listed in American military summaries after the war. According to these reports, bags filled with Reichsmarks, US dollars, Swiss francs, British pounds, and other foreign notes were loaded onto rail cars near Berlin. These shipments were labeled as financial material, but did not appear in regular German railway logs. A second wave followed in late February. This time, the cargo included wooden crates packed with gold bars, many of them lined with straw to cushion the metal and disguise the sound of shifting weight. A third convoy moved out in early March, filling 13 freight cars. Later, US Army records describe the total weight from this final group as more than 100 tons of gold. At the Kaiserroda mine near Merkers, workers who came forward after the war said these shipments arrived quietly, often at night. They recalled SS guards overseeing the unloading of the crates and sealing off parts of the mine that had not been used before. Some chambers had new wooden walls reinforced with steel. Others had doors bolted from the inside, which suggested that the guards wanted to control access through a single route. Mine personnel also mentioned that people working in nearby tunnels were ordered to stay out of certain areas without explanation. These accounts matched the timeline of the convoys leaving Berlin and arriving in Thuringia. By early April, the German command structure in the region was collapsing. On April 3rd and April 4th, the US Third Army moved into the Merkers area. German officials attempted to relocate the stored material in the days just before the arrival of American forces, but fuel shortages and destroyed roads made it impossible. A field report noted that several trucks loaded with bags of currency were abandoned near the mine entrance. At the same time, the local mayor, or Bürgermeister, was questioned by U.S. officers about civilians passing through the town. He repeated a comment he had heard from two women traveling west. They said that paintings and gold were hidden in the mine. On April 6th, these two women were interviewed directly. Their description of sealed chambers, guard patrols, and the placement of wooden partitions matched what the U.S. Army had already seen near the entrance. Their information led the Counterintelligence Corps to request a full inspection of the lower levels. The next morning, April 7th, American engineers used equipment to reach the sealed chambers. Breaking through the heavy doors took several hours. When they finally entered the first room, they began photographing and recording everything inside. The process continued for days as each chamber was opened. The official inventory showed gold from several national central banks, including Belgium, the Netherlands, and Hungary. Some bars still carried their original stamps, while others had been recast by the Reichsbank. There were also bags filled with coins from different countries. Personal valuables appeared as well. Boxes contained rings, watches, and small items that had been melted or sorted for processing. Dental gold stored in canvas bags matched statements later given by Reichsbank employees during Allied interrogations. In the adjoining chambers, U.S. forces found large stacks of artwork, archives, and museum collections. Many crates held markings from European museums and cultural institutions. Some contained documents taken from government offices across occupied territories. On April 12th, General Dwight Eisenhower, General George Patton, and General Omar Bradley toured the chambers. Their visit was documented through photographs and field notes. The purpose was to confirm the scale and authenticity of the find. Afterward, the U.S. Army organized a major transport effort. Beginning on April 14th, 32 trucks moved the gold, currency, and valuables to a secure facility in Frankfurt. Air escorts followed the route to limit the risk of interception or theft. The operation went smoothly, though one field report noted that a single truck was briefly separated from the main convoy before rejoining it. This detail later appeared in books and articles that examined the movement of recovered assets, although no missing items were confirmed. The Merker's discovery demonstrated that the Reich had used hidden storage sites, sealed rooms, and disguised transports to protect its remaining wealth. It also showed that large shipments could move across Germany during the final weeks of the war, even as the country's infrastructure was breaking down. But the confirmed events at Merker's raised another issue. If so much material had been moved west to Thuringia, why were there persistent reports of separate transports heading south and east into Silesia at the same time? The records from Merker's could not answer that question. They only showed what had reached the mine, not what might have gone elsewhere. As investigators compared the Merker's files with other wartime documents, they noticed gaps that suggested parallel operations. Those gaps led them back to the region that had already drawn attention for its unusual rail activity in early 1945. And in that region, a different set of clues began to point toward a train that never appeared in any official arrival logs. As researchers tried to understand the missing transport, they expanded their view beyond the Eastern Front. One major route that drew attention was the Canfranc rail station in the Western Pyrenees. Between 1942 and 1945, this large border complex connected German-occupied France with neutral Spain. It was one of the few places where freight trains could cross with limited checks, and its size allowed officials to move cargo quickly. Wartime station logs showed steady German traffic entering Spain, while Spanish goods such as food, wool, and minerals traveled north. At first, the flow looked routine. Later reviews showed that gold shipments had also passed through the station, and they were handled differently from ordinary freight. Post-war financial audits confirmed that more than 86 tons of German gold moved through Spain using this route. About 12 tons stayed in Spain as payment for supplies and diplomatic cooperation. The rest, roughly 74 tons, continued to Portugal. There it helped fund trade agreements, especially the purchase of tungsten, a mineral vital for hardening steel. These numbers came from bank files, customs logs, and diplomatic correspondence. They also matched Allied intelligence estimates, which tracked gold movements to understand how Germany supported its final war production. The trail did not stop in Portugal. Swiss customs ledgers from the 1940s showed that banks in Switzerland accepted gold, arriving through Spain and Portugal. Once there, it was melted, recast, and given new certificates, which allowed the metal to re-enter global markets without reference to the Reichsbank. Spanish border police formally supervised the crossings, but German diplomatic couriers had exemptions that allowed certain sealed crates to bypass normal inspection. Portuguese trade files also supported this pattern. Tungsten exports rose sharply during the war, and the timing lined up with gold transfers recorded in Spain and Switzerland. Taken together, these files made the Canfranc Corridor one of the best documented channels for German assets leaving Europe. What remained unclear was whether any Eastern transports, especially the one associated with the missing Silesian train, had any link to these Western movements. For years, researchers had little to work with until new information surfaced in 2000. A researcher named Jonathan Diaz entered an unused office inside the Canfranc station complex. The room had been locked for decades and held boxes of wartime papers. Diaz later said he found transport manifests, inspection notes, and correspondence connecting specific trains to German agencies, including those involved in gold transfers. Some documents described Swiss trucks waiting at the border to pick up sealed cargo headed toward Portugal. Others showed Spanish security personnel escorting shipments. The discovery led to a legal dispute. Spain's rail authority argued that the papers were abandoned property and should not have been taken. The case drew national attention and brought renewed focus to the scale of the wartime corridor. Historians examined the documents and confirmed that many matched older customs entries. The records also prompted a broader discussion about Spain's wartime neutrality and whether certain officials cooperated more closely with Germany than earlier accounts suggested. The Canfranc papers clarified how gold moved across Western Europe, but they added complexity as well. Unlike the Mercures discovery, which mainly involved central bank reserves, the gold that moved through Spain came from a mix of sources: central banks, private owners, and wartime evacuations. This made it important to determine whether any of those shipments had originated in Silesia, the region linked to the missing train. When investigators compared the Canfranc documents with rail records from Poland and Germany, they saw movements that overlapped in time but followed different routes. The Western Corridor had strong documentation. The Eastern Corridor was incomplete. And yet, a few pieces of information hinted at a possible link, one that pointed back to the area where the missing Silesian train was last reported. That link remained unclear, but one entry in the recovered papers suggested a connection that had not been noticed before. The 1947 Dutch file added a new layer to the broader search, but it stood apart from the railway cases. This one centered on a field outside the village of Ommeren, about an hour east of Utrecht. According to the post-war statement, several German soldiers claimed they had buried boxes of valuables there in late 1944, during the retreat from the advancing Allied forces. The description was brief. They mentioned wooden chests, a roadside orchard, and a moment of urgency as units pulled back across the Rhine. Dutch investigators followed up soon after the war and inspected the location, but they found no containers. They did note patches of disturbed soil, yet nothing suggested a clear burial site. With no physical evidence, the case was filed away and received almost no attention for decades. What brought the story back into focus was not a new discovery, but a decision in January 2023 by the Dutch National Archives to release a collection of wartime documents after their standard 75-year confidentiality period. Inside that release was the hand-drawn map from the 1947 investigation. It was simple, sketched on lined paper, and marked with 3 crosses. Each cross represented a possible burial point described by the German soldiers. Because the map was part of an official government file, people treated it as more than just a rumor. Within days, it began circulating widely online. The public reaction was immediate. Ommeren is a small rural community, and the appearance of a wartime treasure map drew unexpected attention. Curious visitors arrived to inspect the orchard area, often following the map on their phones. At first, it was only a handful of people. Soon, however, dozens began walking through the fields, hoping to glimpse something unusual in the soil. The situation grew busy enough that local authorities decided to step in. They fenced off the marked area, posted warning signs, and asked visitors to stay on public paths. Their concern was not only about safety, but about preserving the site until specialists could examine it properly. Government experts from the Dutch Cultural Heritage Agency arrived soon after. They used magnetometers and ground-penetrating radar to scan the subsurface. These tools are designed to detect metal or signs of soil disturbance several feet below ground. The team worked methodically, following the map's markings and the 1947 notes. Their scans found no large metal objects, no buried chests, and no shapes consistent with wartime containers. Once the non-invasive surveys were complete, they carried out a controlled excavation at the most promising point. The trench reached down through several layers of soil, but revealed nothing linked to the claim. There were no traces of old wood, metal fragments, or disturbed layers that matched the 1947 description. After completing the examination, officials offered several explanations. One was that the buried items might have been recovered earlier, possibly in the late 1940s or early 1950s, before the story reached public attention. Another possibility was that the map was inaccurate. The German soldiers had been moving under pressure, and their memory of the exact spot might have been imprecise. A third explanation was that the original claim had been overstated. Without physical evidence, none of these theories could be confirmed. What was clear, however, was that the renewed interest showed how strongly wartime rumors still held people's attention. The Ommeren case also reminded investigators how many similar stories existed across Europe. Even unverified claims had the power to reshape local history for a moment, simply because they hinted at something unfinished. And while the Dutch search produced no gold, it added weight to a broader pattern. Caches mentioned in fragmented testimony, maps drawn long after the fact, and locations that lined up roughly, but not precisely, with known wartime movements. Each time one of these stories resurfaced, it led people back to the same question. If one claim eventually proves true, which one will it be? That question grew even more persistent when researchers turned their attention to Lower Silesia, a region where rumors lasted not just decades, but generations. And in those files sat the most debated story of all, tied to a missing train that vanished in 1945. By early 1945, Lower Silesia had become one of the most crowded and unstable regions in Central Europe. German authorities were trying to move people, equipment, and records away from the advancing Red Army. Rail traffic increased sharply, especially around Wrocław and the mountain routes leading toward the Sudetes. Evacuation orders sent factories, ministries, and military units west, and the area's transport network struggled under the pressure. This created gaps in documentation, irregular train movements, and unexplained delays. Some of these gaps would later become part of the gold train discussion, because they matched the same weeks when the missing transport was last mentioned in local reports. At the same time, the landscape itself played a role in shaping later rumors. The Owl Mountains, located south of Wałbrzych, were already a restricted zone. Construction there had begun in 1943 under Organization Todt. The project was known as Riese, which means giant, and it expanded quickly through 1944 and into early 1945. The work involved cutting large tunnels into the mountains, reinforcing caverns, and preparing underground halls whose purpose remains partly unresolved. The main sites were at Osovka, Włodarz, Jeczka, Jugowice, and Sokolec. Each one shows evidence of large-scale excavation, heavy concrete use, and unfinished chambers. Because the work was incomplete when the war ended, none of these sites contain clear documentation of their final intended use. Nearby, Książ Castle underwent major changes as well. The building, which sits above the Pełcznika Valley, was partly converted for administrative or command purposes. Workers installed elevator shafts, strengthened the lower floors, and opened new tunnels under the structure. The exact purpose of these tunnels is debated, but they form part of the broader Riza system. Their location near the main rail routes made the area especially important during the last months of the war. This connection later encouraged speculation that the castle or its tunnels could have been used to store valuables or records moved from the east. Riza depended on forced labor. Gross Rosen, a concentration camp located near Stragom, controlled dozens of subcamps tied to the construction effort. Prisoner lists show high mortality rates due to illness, exhaustion, and limited medical care. These conditions were recorded in post-war testimonies and have since been confirmed by camp records. The size of the labor force and the secrecy of the project meant that movements of materials were frequent and not always documented. This became one of the reasons some researchers looked to the region for missing wartime transports. They argued that goods could have been moved into the tunnels without leaving many official traces. Another element that kept interest alive was the rail network in the mountains. Local reports from 1944 and early 1945 mention extended sidings near forest areas and tracks that ended abruptly at hillsides. Some of these may have been construction routes for Rize. Others appear to have been guarded by SS personnel, according to accounts collected after the war. Several witnesses also described hearing trains stop late at night in areas normally closed to the public. Their statements were gathered in the late 1940s and again in the 1960s, often referring to sealed entrances and earthworks that later collapsed. While none of these accounts are independently verified, they match the period when German authorities were moving large quantities of materials out of the east. Soviet and Polish investigative teams inspected many of these sites after the war. Their field notes describe blocked tunnels, fallen rock, and abandoned construction equipment. They also noted locations where explosions had taken place, likely meant to seal entrances. None of the teams recorded finding a train, sealed or otherwise, and no documents recovered from regional archives confirm the presence of a special transport inside the tunnels. Still, the absence of clear answers allowed the story to continue. The combination of unfinished infrastructure, disrupted rail traffic, and ambiguous witness statements gave researchers many possible starting points, but no final conclusion. These conditions helped shape the environment where the gold train legend took root, a region marked by secrecy, rapid evacuation, and incomplete records created space for questions that have lasted for generations. And into that landscape stepped a man who spent decades trying to connect the fragments and resolve what happened in 1945. Tadeusz Słowikowski began his research at a time when the story of a missing train was still treated as a private rumor rather than a public topic. He lived in Wałbrzych, only a few kilometers from the rail lines where the event was said to have taken place. In the early 1950s, many former German residents were still passing through the area during population transfers. Słowikowski often spoke with them, asking simple questions about what they remembered from the final months of the war. Most offered only general impressions, but one conversation changed the course of his work. A man identified in later notes as Schultz mentioned an underground passage near the 65th kilometer marker on the line between Wałbrzych and Wrocław. He said this location had been sealed shortly after a train entered it in 1945. The statement was brief, but it introduced a new point on the map. Over the next several years, Słowakovsky tried to confirm whether that area showed signs of wartime construction. He examined old topographic charts created by Polish rail authorities after 1945 and looked for differences between those and maps produced during the German period. He noticed changes in the shape of nearby embankments and in the alignment of a service track that once connected to the main line. None of these changes proved anything on their own, but they suggested the land had been altered. This encouraged him to continue gathering material. As he collected more interviews, he heard a second account. This one involved a family living near the same section of track. A witness claimed that on May 5, 1945, a heavy train arrived under guard, entered a covered area, and did not come out. According to the testimony, the family who saw the activity disappeared soon afterward. The information was unverified, but the date, location, and details lined up with the period when German authorities were moving equipment out of Silesia. By the 1960s, he had assembled enough documents to begin forming a hypothesis about the movement of a special transport. He continued to expand his files by visiting archives in Wrocław and Jelenia Góra, requesting rail service logs, land reform surveys, and post-war aerial photographs. Some of the aerial images, taken by Polish authorities between 1945 and 1947, showed depressions in the soil and patterns that he believed resembled filled-in trenches. To better explain his ideas to local officials, he built scale models of the area. These models included the track layout, the surrounding slopes, and the suspected location of a covered rail siding. He used them during meetings with regional offices responsible for heritage sites, though the responses were cautious. Officials acknowledged the effort, but did not authorize excavation. Słowakovsky's work also depended on personal testimonies. He spoke with miners who had worked in the Wałbrzych Basin after the war. Some recalled areas where access was restricted in 1945, especially near tunnels and unused side tracks. Railway workers offered similar comments. They described sections of line that were repaired quickly after the war, but had shown signs of earlier demolition. These testimonies varied in detail, but they gave him a broader picture of how the region functioned during the last days of German control. His research did not always proceed smoothly. In interviews made later in his life, he said he received threatening letters and experienced acts of vandalism at his home. He also reported that his dog had been poisoned in the 1980s, though the incident was never linked to any specific person. These events did not stop his work, but they added a layer of difficulty. Despite the challenges, he continued to meet with anyone who might provide new information. One breakthrough came when the director of Kasiąż Castle allowed him to review archival notes about underground alterations made in 1944 and 1945. These notes confirmed that large construction orders were issued in the final months of the war, lending support to his view that the region's infrastructure could have been used for concealed transport. By the 1990s, local authorities recognized his long-term documentation and consulted him during surveys connected to regional history. While no excavation was approved on the scale he hoped for, his work organized decades of scattered stories into a structured timeline. That timeline would become central many years later, when a new claim brought sudden global attention to the legend he had spent most of his life studying. When the claim surfaced in August 2015, it immediately changed the scale of the long-running debate. For decades, discussion about a missing train in Silesia had moved slowly, shaped mostly by local researchers and small historical circles. That pace shifted on August 20th, 2015, when Piotr Koper, a construction contractor from Wałbrzych, and Andreas Richter, a German amateur historian, delivered a formal notification to Polish authorities. Their statement said that ground-penetrating radar scans taken near the 65th kilometer rail marker revealed the outline of a train buried underground. The claim matched the same location mentioned in earlier accounts collected by Tadeusz Słowikowski, which added to the public interest. But what drew real attention were the images themselves. The scans included long, regular shapes that appeared to sit in parallel rows, similar to freight cars lined up on a track. Early descriptions placed the anomaly at a depth of about 50 meters, though the exact figure varied among reports. Officials requested more information, and length estimates began circulating in the press. Some placed the object at around 120 meters, others closer to 150. Either range was consistent with a wartime military transport made up of several covered rail cars and a locomotive. The combination of location, shape, and historical context created a sense that this might be the most concrete lead in years. Within days, Deputy Minister of Culture Piotr Żuchowski reviewed the scans in a closed meeting. He later stated publicly that he was 99% convinced the images showed a train. His comment, delivered during an interview, helped move the story from local news to international coverage. Major outlets in Germany, Poland, the United Kingdom, and the United States released breaking news alerts within hours. Crews arrived in Wałbrzych with satellite trucks and began setting up at nearby laybys and forest clearings to film live segments. Reporters described the site in careful terms, noting that the area had been part of a busy evacuation route in early 1945 and was close to locations linked to Riese construction. That combination of wartime activity and modern scanning technology made the story easy to frame for a wide audience. Local residents found themselves answering questions about old rumors that many had grown up hearing but had never expected to see discussed on television. Authorities responded quickly. The area around the reported site was fenced off to prevent people from digging on their own, which had already begun to occur in small numbers. Because the region was known to contain unexploded ordnance from the war, the army deployed sapper units to assess whether the soil posed any immediate hazards. Their presence added a practical layer to the situation, as any excavation would need to be done slowly and under controlled conditions. Meanwhile, the town saw an unusual rise in visitors. Hotels filled at a pace normally seen during peak holidays. Souvenir stands extended their hours. Tours began guiding groups along the rail corridor, pointing out markers, embankments, and sections mentioned in both wartime files and modern research. Even as the excitement grew, local officials tried to keep expectations grounded. They noted that ground-penetrating radar could show shapes that required careful interpretation, especially in areas with natural rock formations and old construction debris. Still, they acknowledged the strength of public interest and stated that a controlled excavation could be possible once the safety assessment was complete. For many, this step felt like a turning point, a moment when a long-running local story might finally be tested with modern equipment and formal oversight. The decision now rested on technical experts who would have to determine the best way to verify what lay beneath the surface. And as their evaluation began, the first signs appeared that the outcome might not match the early confidence. When the technical review began, the first step was to examine the scans without the pressure of public expectation. Specialists from AGH University of Science and Technology in Krakow were asked to provide an independent analysis. Their team had long experience with radar data used in mining, environmental surveys, and archaeological work. After several weeks of study, they concluded that the shapes in the images were consistent with natural geological layers. They noted that compressed soil, fractured rock, and uneven moisture zones could create regular reflections that looked artificial when viewed in two-dimensional slices. Their assessment found no clear signs of metal, straight-walled cavities, or structural symmetry that would point to a buried train. In the following months, two more groups carried out reviews. The Polish Geological Institute conducted its own evaluation and reached the same conclusion. The reflections appeared geological. Private geophysical firms hired by the municipality also confirmed that the images did not match known patterns associated with rail cars or tunnels. By late 2015, the weight of expert opinion leaned heavily toward a natural explanation, even if it did not satisfy those who believed the story had deeper foundations. But the matter did not end there. In early 2016, officials received an anonymous letter claiming the radar survey had missed the true site by a short distance. The letter included a hand-drawn sketch showing an alternate point along the embankment. Because the story had already drawn so much attention, authorities decided they had to respond. They concluded that a controlled dig, carried out under supervision and within safety rules, would resolve the debate more clearly than analysis alone. In August 2016, an excavation team assembled near the 65th kilometer marker. 64 workers took part, a mix of geologists, military engineers, municipal staff, and heritage specialists. The operation cost roughly $130,000, funded partly by the town and partly by private support. Trenches were dug in a systematic order, starting with the area marked in the anonymous letter and extending outward. Workers documented each layer with photographs and soil measurements. They looked for signs of disturbed earth, man-made fill, or buried metal. After 7 days, the results were clear. No tracks, no tunnels, and no structural remains were found in the opened ground. Shortly after the work stopped, Piotr Koper and Andreas Richter announced that they no longer stood by their first interpretation of the radar data. They said they accepted the geological explanation, even if they still believed the region held unanswered questions from the final weeks of the war. Their statement marked a shift in public attention, and many observers assumed the story would end there. Yet the official reports left several details unresolved. Investigators noted sealed tunnel mouths and collapsed cuts in nearby hillsides. These features were not recent. Some appeared in early post-war photographs, while others matched descriptions from local diaries written in 1945. Wartime rail plans reviewed during the study showed several branches in the area listed as active in late 1944 and early 1945, but later scratched out without explanation. No surviving document explains why those changes were made. Another detail came from Soviet engineering notes written shortly after the region was taken in 1945. The notes mention debris clearance along the same corridor, but they do not describe what was removed. Whether the debris was natural rock, wartime equipment, or abandoned rail material is not stated, leaving a gap that researchers still discuss today. These loose ends did little to support the idea of a buried train, but they also did not align smoothly with the conclusion that nothing unusual happened in the area. With so many pieces that did not fully match, the question shifted from whether the 2015 claim was correct to why the region's evidence formed an uneven picture at all. By the time researchers turned to the surviving wartime documents, they found a record that was uneven from the start. Declassified Allied reports from 1945 list several transport trains that left Silesia in early April, but their arrival points were never logged. These were not ordinary trains. Some carried military stores, others carried administrative files, and a few were marked as special transports, a term the Reich used for shipments that required extra security. The files do not state what was inside those cars. They only show departure dates from stations near Wrocław and Wałbrzych, with blank spaces where the arrival stamps should be. In a normal system, those gaps would have been corrected or questioned. In the closing days of the war, they were simply filed and never updated again. Local rail office records show the same pattern. Archivists studying documents from Lower Silesia found missing pages, overwritten entries, and car numbers that jump without explanation. In one case, a manifest dated April 7, 1945, lists 16 cars departing Świebodzice, but the next preserved entry lists only 11 arriving at a nearby junction. The record includes no note of detachment or loss. It is possible the pages that explained the change were destroyed. It is also possible the cars were reassigned along the way. Without full logs, the differences cannot be resolved. These irregularities do not prove the existence of a gold train, but they do show that the rail system in those final weeks left a trail that is hard to follow with confidence. Another gap comes from the destruction of SS Technical Unit orders in early May 1945. These units handled engineering tasks, including tunnel maintenance and secure transport planning. As Soviet forces advanced, many of their documents were burned during the evacuation toward the Czech border. According to post-war intelligence interviews, several officers confirmed that files were destroyed, but did not specify their contents. This loss matters because the region around Wałbrzych had a high number of underground sites tied to Project Riza, a construction program that still has incomplete documentation today. With so many records removed, it is difficult to know which movements were routine engineering tasks and which involved sensitive materials. After the war, Soviet trophy brigades collected large quantities of German equipment, documents, and valuables from Silesia. Their operations moved fast, and they did not always produce detailed lists. Reports confirm removals from depots and factories, but they rarely identify what was taken from each location. Some historians suggest that if a train or rail cache existed, it might have been cleared during these operations. Others argue there is no direct link, since the brigades focused on visible stockpiles rather than buried or hidden sites. The lack of itemized Soviet records leaves another space where evidence could have answered key questions, but does not. Researchers point to one confirmed example that adds weight to the possibility of emergency transfers: the Merkers mine discovery in April 1945. There, the U.S. Army found more than 7,000 gold bars, currency reserves, and art stored underground. The find proves that major movements of valuables took place in the last weeks of the war. But whether Silesia saw another version of that operation is unknown. Some scholars believe small caches were scattered across the region. Others continue to examine the idea of a single armored train carrying valuables or archives, noting that the gaps in the records leave room for either scenario. As a result, the gold train legend remains part of local history. Museums in Wałbrzych now include exhibits on the search. Annual conferences review new findings, and tourism centers still receive questions from visitors who want to know if the story might one day be proven. Alongside the public interest is an ethical issue that historians consistently stress. If any valuables linked to the missing transports were ever found, they would need to be returned to the families and institutions from which they were taken. This point shapes modern research and ensures the subject is handled with care. The confirmed discoveries at places like Merkers and along routes studied after the war show that major transfers of valuables did happen. But the case of the Silesian gold train sits in a different space, caught between real evacuations, missing rail logs, and accounts that never align enough to close the file. Modern searches have shown how difficult it is to match memory with physical proof, yet they also show how strongly these stories remain in local communities. After 80 years, the question has not faded. It remains because parts of the record were never finished, and because some evidence still sits just out of reach. And for many researchers, that unfinished trail is exactly what keeps the search alive.